there's a variety of ways to sell a business, and they're on a spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, we have direct negotiation between one buyer and one seller, which is largely the worst way to ever sell a business. It usually ends in failure, low prices, and disappointment. On the other end of the spectrum, we have what's called a controlled auction process. It is a very formal, rules-based process, and you have this spectrum. The majority of middle market businesses, though, and when the process is run correctly, are typically sold somewhere in the middle, which I refer to as a quasi-auction or a modified auction. Now, I'm not going to go into auction theory today. I did a speech earlier this year at the AZ PPO conference. We'll put a link in the comments. You could take a look at that if you're interested in understanding more about the difference between a controlled auction, a modified auction, and how well that works. For our purposes today, we're going to focus right in the middle at the modified auction, and that is the best process typically for middle market businesses. And if your investment banker is worth his salt, this is the process that he's going to construct. So we've got realistic expectations. We have an aspirational price. Now it's time to look at the acquisition universe. Again, leverage. We're going to think about leverage and power, and the best way that we can get leverage is competition. So prior to going out to the market, as we're formulating our game plan, we're going to do some research on the acquisition universe. And we're going to look at all of the publicly traded national companies that are in your industry. Right? If you own a lawn care business, we're going to look at the national players. We're going to look at the private equity-backed players. We're going to look at some of the regional players. And depending upon how big your business is, we're not going to call local competitors. Oftentimes it doesn't make sense. We're going to be as broad as we possibly can with finding the acquirers to put into the acquisition universe. But we're not going to boil the ocean. We're not just throwing things up against the wall. I know a lot of times business brokers will sell businesses through listings, right? And they'll put a listing online, which to me was always somewhat asinine. I mean, it's almost, in some ways, it's like selling an antique Stradivarius violin on Craigslist. It just never really made sense to me, and the facts speak for themselves. The processes usually don't yield the seller nearly as much as they should if you actually go out hunting as opposed to just fishing and throwing your bait in the water to see what bites. No, you've got to be a hunter in this particular case. So you've got to get very sophisticated about the acquisition universe. So go out and figure out what private equity firms want to be in this market, what private equity firms are in this market, what national players are in this market. And now you start to build an acquisition universe. So you've got a list of acquirers. And as you start to think about the list of acquirers and you're working on fine-tuning the business and you're putting together what we'll oftentimes refer to as a CIM, a confidential information memo. Sometimes it's called an offering memo. Sometimes it's called a book. I mean, there's a variety of terms for it, but effectively what you're doing is you're taking the financial statements, you're summarizing the business, the operations, the employees, the history, so on and so forth. And you have a memo that might be 30 or 40 pages long. And it's this memo that every acquirer is going to have an opportunity to take a look at, and they'll be required to make their initial bid based on these materials.